Thank you all for joining me this afternoon. I appreciate you taking the time out of your schedules to be here. And I just wanted to sort of give you an early warning, if you will, so that you can plan better to avoid events like this in the future. That it's my intent to do this once a semester, to just come together with as many members of the campus community as would feel it would be useful for you, and to share ideas, to share some thoughts, and to talk about them. And that's really the intent today and going forward into the future. To get us started, though, I want to spend a little bit of time setting a context for some of my remarks that I want to share with you about what I see as important priorities of the university. These priorities don't come a priori. They're based on experience, they're based on input, they're based on a lot of, I think, thoughtful discussion amongst a whole sort of groups. And that's certainly been the case for the priorities that I want to share with you today. They're based on a year here. And talking across the state and really across the country with members of the URI family, with our external constituencies, with people who are interested in what we're doing, who feel they have a partnership with us. And those conversations have been very rich, and I think they have been very influential for me in sort of shaping where I think URI needs to focus in the next few years. But first, I want to share with you some context. Now, you know me well enough to know that I'm not a historian. I'm not nearly smart enough to be a historian. I'm a biochemist, so I'm not going to set a historical context for you. What I am going to do is use a very overused phrase, but which I think is applicable in this case, and share with you what I think is, to a certain sense, in our DNA. It's part of what makes us who we are. It's part of the intrinsic, I think, core values and the intrinsic nature of the University of Rhode Island. And it'll take a few minutes because I'm going to quote some things that I think are foundational, in a certain sense, quote the DNA sequence to you. The first quote comes from the Morrill Act of 1862. And you've heard me talk about it. It's the foundational document that created the land-grant university system in the United States. And it reads as follows. It talks about money, and then it says, each state may take and claim the benefit of this act, that is, the monies, the revenues that arise from the land grant, to the endowment, support, and maintenance of at least one college where the leading object shall be, without excluding other scientific and classical studies, and including military tactics, to teach such branches of learning as are related to agriculture and the mechanic arts, in such manner as the legislatures of the states may respectively prescribe, in order to promote the liberal and practical education of the industrial classes on the several pursuits and professions in life. That's how we were founded. That's our original charter, if you will. We're in a part of the United States where charters are very important and compacts are very important. And if you will, this is the core of who we are yet today. That was followed up in 1887 by a further act, which in the preamble of that act makes the following claim. It is further the policy of the Congress to promote the efficient production, marketing, distribution, and utilization of products of the farm as essential to the health and welfare of our peoples, and to promote a sound and prosperous agriculture and rural life as indispensable to the maintenance of maximum employment and national prosperity and security. That's the Hatch Act of 1887. And it expanded, if you will, the role of the land-grant university in the way that I just mentioned. That was followed in 1914 by a subsequent act of Congress called the Smith-Lever Act, in which it states in its purpose, in order to aid in diffusing among the people of the United States useful and practical information on subjects relating to agriculture, home economics, and rural energy, and to encourage the application of the same. So there the mandate was to disseminate, to distribute useful and practical information. And then from 1914 until 1980, Congress sort of let the land-grant universities be. But in 1980, they fundamentally changed the entire landscape for public universities, for all universities, and particularly for land-grant universities, with the passage in 1980 of the Bayh-Dole Act, which Peter Alfonso has memorized. Because it states in the preamble to that act, the purpose, it is the policy and objective of the Congress to use the patent system to promote the utilization of inventions arising from federally supported research and development, to encourage maximum participation of small business firms in federally supported research and development efforts, to promote collaboration between commercial concerns and nonprofit organizations, including universities, to ensure that inventions made by nonprofit organizations and small business firms are used in a manner to promote free competition and enterprise, to promote the commercialization and public availability of inventions made in the United States industry and labor. Those four acts, in essence, define who URI is. They are, in essence, the DNA of this institution. What I want to do is talk with you for a little bit about how I interpret those words in the 21st century. Because I think we can historically look back at the intent of Congress, and some of the phrasing that they used there we don't use anymore. The industrial class, for example, is not a phrase you find in common use anymore. But it's the heart of what was in the Morrill Act. And what it means by that, really, is it meant we're going to educate the common people. Education, higher education in particular, no longer belongs to the wealthy, privileged business class, or, for that matter, to the leisure, moneyed class. Higher education belongs to the common people, and the common people should receive the benefits of higher education because Congress in 1862 foresaw, I think the truth of it now is probably beyond anybody's expectations in 1862, but they foresaw that education, beyond what was possible in the public school system or the private school system in the country at the time that has existed in 1862, was going to be indispensable. And indeed it is. So here's some of the ways I think about this now that I wanted to share with you. First, all of these acts, all of these congressional actions really are founded on the proposition that we educate for a purpose. That education has a purpose. That education is not something rarefied, not something merely to be enjoyed, not something merely to be assimilated, but education is something to be used. And I think we sometimes forget that we're here to educate for a purpose. But I think we as land-grant institutions should really never forget that. Secondly, they make the point that research exists and is supported to build a prosperous and sustainable economy. That is also intrinsic to our mission. As intrinsic to our mission as a land-grant research university as education itself. And Congress certainly intended for the results of that research to be disseminated amongst the people for useful and practical education, if you will, to get the discoveries, the knowledge, the thoughts of the university faculty and the university students out into the hands and minds of people who could put it into everyday application to make their lives better and to build a sustainable and prosperous nation. And finally, in 1980, Congress handed public research universities in particular, and nonprofit organizations more generally, the implied duty to transfer and commercialize discoveries. By congressional intent, we have been handed that duty. So it is not enough for us to merely conduct research or to do scholarship or creative works. It is required of us, in a certain sense, for us to think about what the applications of those discoveries, that scholarship, that creative work might be, and where applicable, seek to commercialize and transfer that out to build a stronger national economy. That's also part of our duty. And I think all of these things are probably more applicable to the University of Rhode Island now than at any particular point in its past. And it is important for us, I think, not to forget that that's who we are and why we exist. That these are the expectations which the Congress of the United States has placed on us, which has been amplified by numerous actions of state legislatures and governors across these United States, and which has been expanded by the expectations of the people of the United States as they increasingly look to us, to public universities like us, for all of the assistance that they're seeking to make their lives better. That's why we're here. And that means to me something very special, and that is that when we think about education here, we need to think of it in two ways. One, we need to educate so that we produce informed, and increasingly what that means, at the rate of change we see in knowledge now, increasingly it means we create students who are able to inform themselves, that is, to keep on learning long after they leave our doors. But we need to create informed, effective citizens. And I think that's one of the classic arguments for the value of a college education in the liberal arts and more broadly that has been articulated, is the necessity in a democracy in particular for the citizenry who's asked ultimately to make the great decisions by virtue of whom they vote for, to have the capability to make informed decisions, to be effective citizens, to be able to participate and not just have things done to them by their government. That's one. But secondly, and this is one that in some parts of the academy I think is subject to criticism, but I don't think should be for us in the land-grant tradition. Education exists to prepare our students for a career. Yes, a job. We're here to help our students at the end of their time at the University of Rhode Island succeed in pursuing a career, in landing a job, in building a life, in having what it takes to be competitive in the 21st century. And yes, education has a higher purpose, and some may argue a nobler purpose. Education may exist for a whole lot of reasons, but certainly one reason it always exists, and it's one of the things our students and their families will tell us they always assumed it existed for, is to prepare them for employment, for a career, to put them in a position where they can pursue their dreams, their hopes, and their aspirations. And if we ignore that responsibility, we're failing to educate in the way that we should, in my opinion. I don't believe these two aspects of education are mutually exclusive or contradictory at all. And I think we can look at the achievements of many of our alumni to see the reality of this, because I believe, as a good cook must, and that's not me, but I watch my wife, who's a master in the kitchen, that the proof is indeed in the pudding, or the Indian banquet, or whatever else that you've prepared. And you can look at the success of our alumni and see that we, the University of Rhode Island, long before I got here, succeeded admirably in preparing its graduates to pursue all kinds of things, many of whom are doing the kinds of things you look at would bear no resemblance whatsoever to what they majored in, like being the CEO of a national food company after majoring in music. But that same alumnus would tell you that that education that they received at URI in music prepared them extremely well for the career that they're now pursuing. And to me, that is an indication, that's a hard piece of data that suggests the purposes of education that I talked about are neither mutually exclusive or contradictory, that we can prepare our students for success at the same time that we instill in them the values and appreciation for a liberal education, and we prepare them for life as effective, productive, informed citizens of the United States. If we then translate to the immediate, I think, context in which we're working, I'd just like to share with you some thoughts I have about what our students need to look like now if they're going to be successful. That is, if they are really going to be educated in the way that I've been talking about, so that they can do both things, be the citizen that they need to be and be as successful as they need to be to pursue their hopes and dreams. And I think many of these characteristics have long been characteristics of successful college graduates, but some of them are perhaps new, and some of them, I think, perhaps have greater force now than they once did. I think our students need to be innovative. They need to be innovators. They need to be flexible and adaptable. Most of them will change careers multiple times after graduation. They need to be responsive to a rapidly changing context, a rapidly changing world. And they need to have the ability to analyze and assimilate critically relevant information in order to judge the veracity of that information, the reliability of that information, and ultimately to decide. If those are the skills that we want our students to have, then it seems to me that you or I should look like that. We as an institution, as a faculty and staff, need to be innovative, flexible, adaptable, responsive, and have the ability to be driven by data to analyze and assimilate relevant information, to judge it, and then to decide what we're going to do on the basis of that data or that information. And all of us, it's incumbent upon all of us who are on the faculty in particular, but I would argue on the staff and in the administration, all of us who work at URI, to model these characteristics for our students. Because if they're going to learn it, who are they going to learn it from? It should be us. That's why we're here. And if we want them, if they need to be like this, then we need to be like that for them. And I think that does have a lot of, I think, implications for what we do as an institution. There's a further context that I want to briefly share with you. I think these, everybody knows, and everybody says, even people who really don't care say that they understand that these are challenging times for higher education. It's challenging times for our nation. And we all know what those are. Certainly, it's funding. And the funding for public higher education in particular has probably never been more problematic, because we are not only on the cusp of a historic recession, the cusp of hopefully coming out of it, but with many of its consequences yet to be felt. But we are also at a time when that recession came at the end of really 2 decades of systematic disinvestment by most of the states of these United States in public higher education. In a certain sense, this recession came at a time when already resources were being drained in practically every state in the nation away from public higher education. That is, we went into this recession not from a high point, most of us, but from a low point, or certainly a lower point than had been the norm. At one point, it was the norm. You don't have to go back all that far. In fact, you can go back to the time in which I was an undergraduate, which I like to think was not so long ago, but the students keep telling me, oh my God, that's a long, long time ago, which was the early 70s, to when the cost of a public higher education at even an institution like the University of California, arguably the most distinguished public university in America, was very affordable. The equivalent of tuition for me as an undergraduate was $900 a year. And room and board was about $1,000. And books were no more than $100 a quarter. I still have many of those books with prices that are shocking for our current students. Let me tell you, an economics textbook for $10, for instance. Brand new hardback. Steve hasn't seen a $10 textbook in 10 years, probably, in economics. The point is at that time, the cost of public higher education for students was borne, or largely, to 75, 80, 85% by the taxpayers of the state. Those days are long gone in practically every state. And on top of that, we now have really a historic financial crisis that has enveloped the nation and much of the world, that has further impacted the funding for higher education. At the same time that that's happened, I think there's no question whatsoever that expectations for us have grown, not diminished. It seems to be a law of some sort. I couldn't find it in Congress, but I didn't look that carefully, because I don't believe it exists anyway. It seems to be a law at some point that as state legislatures decrease funding, they do not decrease accountability. That is, they still expect the same level of say, of involvement, of decision-making, of policy setting for higher education as they did in the days when they truly did provide 85% of the cost of educating a resident of the state as an undergraduate. So expectations have gone up, not down. Expectations of our students and families have risen over time. We're not only expected anymore to provide the education, we're expected to actively assist those students in obtaining that education. We're expected to provide students a leg up in getting that first career position. We're expected to provide a range of services, a range of support services to students that previously universities were not expected to provide. The families expect it, the students expect it, a lot of the growth in the budgets of higher education. Critics like to look at it and call that administrative bloat. What they don't look at when they look at that is look inside and see what are those people doing. And many of the times they're providing the services that the students and their families demand and expect and frankly need. And that's been a big growth in the cost to institutions over time. Expectations have grown from our external partners and would-be partners, from communities, from states, from companies, from individuals. What are you going to do to help me in these difficult times? Accountability expectations have grown. Gone is the day where universities, I think, could confidently assert that we know what we're doing, trust us, look at the success that we're having by real measures, namely the growth in research, the prominence of the United States in all the leading disciplines of the world, the success of our students. Look at all those things and you will know that we're doing the job that we should do. And we're doing it well. And I think that's a powerful argument, but it's an argument that is increasingly not accepted. Our public demands greater accountability from us than those kinds of assurances. They want to know, why are our retention and graduation rates for public universities where they are? Why is it that a former institution of mine, Amherst College, has a 4-year graduation rate of probably 98 to 99%, and places like the University of Rhode Island will have a 4-year graduation rate of 60% or less? Why is that? Why do 99.5% of the students at an Amherst College who start as freshmen return as sophomores, and only 75% or less of students at many public colleges and universities who start as freshmen return as sophomores? Why does that happen? What are the reasons for that? Those questions are going to continue to be asked until we provide answers that the people asking those questions find plausible. And so far, higher education has not been, I think, as persuasive in providing those answers as it probably needs to be. There's a great deal of expectation out there that we need to be more accountable for cost. And that's what we should expect. The public policy decision, which in effect has been made in the United States to shift the cost of higher education from the state's taxpayers to the families of the students and the students themselves, has been a public policy decision that hasn't been explicit. It's just been incrementally made over a large number of years, until now families look at the cost of education and wonder, how can this continue and how can we afford it? I was asked the other day at a meeting at a Rotary Club by an individual who was very familiar with the situation at Duke University, said the current tuition at Duke, now it's a private institution, and fees, comprehensive, is $51,000. And he asked a very reasonable question. If one extrapolates that number forward into the future, how is it conceivable that people can pay? How is that conceivable? And yet, a lot of people in higher education make decisions every day which I think can be interpreted as saying, that kind of growth should be expected to continue, because we're frequently in the position of saying what we're doing, particularly in the public land grant arena, the public university agreement, and the data completely support us in this. I think the data are very clear. What URI has done over the past several years is simply raise tuition to offset the decline in state funding. And I think what the people are saying, well, that may be true, but it still puts us on a curve that, if projected into the future, becomes implausible. It becomes a reality that no one can really grapple with or accept. I mean, the reality is, will state funding continue to drop until it's practically near zero? Frankly, if you look at the constraints on many states, the ever-escalating costs of things like Medicaid, for instance, and other programs, you don't have to extrapolate too far out into the future to decide that indeed the funding for state universities will be very close to zero. The University of Colorado Boulder did this extrapolation famously a few years ago to gasps, I think both in their audience and across Colorado, but the data were clear. You just looked at what Colorado was doing and extrapolated forward a relatively few number of years into the future. Essentially, Colorado would have completely disinvested from funding the University of Colorado Boulder, Colorado State, or any other flagship institutions of the Colorado public higher education system. Okay, now you know the kinds of things I think about. And the kinds of things that I've thought about a lot as I've listened to people across Rhode Island and across the United States who are affiliated with us, connected to us, a part of our family, and have shaped the priorities that I think, from my perspective, we need to embrace at the University of Rhode Island. And I've distilled them down to four. I've distilled them down to four. And I want to share them briefly with you, and then I'll stop talking and we can talk about anything else you want, including the recent success of the football team. We can certainly talk about that, or would be happy to talk about nothing else, I'm sure. We could talk about anything, really. But here are the priorities that I wanted to lay out in front of you, that I've talked about widely in some respects to some of you already. First, I think URI needs to accept the challenge of really recreating undergraduate education. I don't think that we're serving our students well if we continue to do, no matter how successful we've been, the same things that have made us successful. I believe that the challenges that we're facing will demand of us a critical examination of what we're doing, why we're doing it, and how we can do it better. Because I think we need, in the current climate of increasing expectations and certainly constrained budgets, and a lot of interest in what we're going to do, a lot of demands for assistance from us, I think we need to reconsider, if you will, how we're going about some very fundamental aspects of our work together. And I think we need to ask the questions, how can we educate our students for a world that grows increasingly globalized, increasingly complicated, and where the rate of change seems to grow on an annual basis? How do we prepare our students to thrive in a world like that? That's really the question that I think needs to consume all of us. How do we prepare our students for the world that they will face? And I think for us to successfully do that, without saying at all or implying at all that the modalities that we've used and the faculties that have done them are in any way deficient or have in any way been inadequate to the task at which we set them or use them for. I'm talking now about the technologies and teaching methods that we use. We just need to accept the fact that the world is a different place now and will be a different place a year from now and a year after that than it was 5 years ago or 10 years ago, or in certain respects as it was 200 or 300 years ago when some of the ways of teaching were first developed that we're still using because they've been so successful. So I think we need to think about that very critically. And URI, one of the reasons I'm here is because URI had already demonstrated it's willing to do that. I think the academic plan that the university put forward really exemplifies a lot of very, very good thinking about how we need to educate students for success in the 21st century. I think we need to continue on that trajectory. I think we need to continue to think about what we're doing and why we're doing it and ask ourselves, how can we do it better? And here are just a few examples. We know, I think there are good data out there that are very clear, that suggest that there are tools that we can use in instruction of students that enhance their learning and make it possible for them to learn even more quickly than they have if those tools are not applied. We need to use those tools. There's a lot of research out there and studies out there, qualitative and quantitative, that say our students succeed better and are better prepared, in a certain sense, that are better educated. If we think about education also as engaging them in the creative work of the faculty, in the life of the mind, in discoveries, in research, in creative work and scholarship, to get them out of formal classrooms and into settings where they're confronted by problems that no one has solved and asked to do things that no one has done. You've heard me say this before. I think it's very clear that we need to be an institution that fosters and creates that kind of learning environment for our students. There are a whole host of other things I could talk about along those lines. But I think that the critical point is this. We are in an excellent position to lead. We're a relatively small place. We have a faculty which has distinguished itself for years by its devotion to excellence in undergraduate education as well as graduate education. A faculty that has been committed to high-quality teaching and values it, and an institution that values it. I think we can build on that foundation if we're willing to accept the challenges of thinking somewhat differently about the things that we've done and really become an institution that's recognized for innovation in this area, for creating new pathways to degrees, for creating opportunities for students to do more in a semester, to proceed through work more at a pace consistent with their own ability to do the work, as opposed to a pace that's dictated by a totally arbitrary academic calendar that dates back to the land-grant era, when it was absolutely necessary for students to be at home during planting and harvest. Let's do that, I'm saying. Let's take that challenge. The second priority, and it's related to the first for the reasons I've already articulated, is we need to grow the research and scholarly enterprise at the University of Rhode Island at an even faster pace than it has grown. That's a big challenge because it's grown pretty rapidly in the last 2 to 3 years. And again, by virtue of the superb faculty that exists here, their energy, their international competitiveness, and their desire to bring in the resources necessary to pursue their scholarship. It's really their success when we look at the growth of the research enterprise at the University of Rhode Island. What I'm saying is we need to put together the tools, the policies, the decisions, the structures, the facilities, and the infrastructure to allow them to be even more successful, and to create for them the opportunity to engage our undergraduates in their work, to grow graduate education, the number of graduate students enrolled on the campus, the involvement of graduate students in that work, and to really build a community of discovery that encompasses our freshmen to our PhD candidates defending their dissertations, as well as the faculty, in a way that I think enhances education and at the same time produces the very kind of results which the nation and the world so desperately need with regard to new knowledge, new technologies, new wisdom, new ways of imagining, new ways of seeing, whether it's in art or history, whether it's in economics, in business, whether it's in engineering or science, biotech or pharmacy, across the board, this should be our goal. The third priority for the institution, I think, is to face the reality that Kingston, Rhode Island is connected to every other part of the world in ways that sometimes make us uncomfortable. We need to internationalize and globalize what we're doing here on the campus. We need to get our students out in the world, and we need to bring the world to Kingston. We need to have a curriculum that really looks at things from a variety of perspectives, not just local ones. And we already have that curriculum in a great many respects. But there probably are other opportunities for us to thoughtfully consider how we're going to bring the kind of international perspectives and provide those perspectives and those experiences to our students so that they're prepared to thrive in a world where they may spend a good part of their careers working elsewhere than the United States. And when, even if they don't, they may well be working with partners from places elsewhere than the United States at all hours of the day. And they need to be prepared to succeed in that kind of environment. And part of, I think, is what's necessary to prepare them to succeed in that kind of environment is to give them the experiences while they're undergraduates and while they're graduate students in living in those environments. Yeah, that means thinking critically about how many of our students acquire languages other than English. You know, I look with alarm, I'm being very candid here, I look with alarm at the decisions that universities are making in very tight budget times to cut back on foreign language instruction. I know it's arguable that English is the international language, and to a certain degree it is. I think the data are clear on that. But I think if you just teach that, and you don't teach our students, we don't model for our students the necessity of being sufficiently familiar with cultures and nations other than the United States and the English-speaking world, that they are handicapped to a certain degree in their ability to live out their dreams and hopes and aspirations in a world where, quite honestly, although English may be spoken, communication exists in many other languages and in many other modalities. We need to think about those things. For example, and we've got some programs that do that extremely well at URI. And finally, and this one is one that I think in some respects is related and embedded in all of the others. I think URI has an opportunity as a university, given its unique place and its unique identity and its history and its composition, to really become a national leader in showing the world, and certainly showing the United States, I believe, the importance of developing a community that is devoted to each other, that welcomes, affirms, and supports all of its members, that is committed to equity and values diversity, and sees diversity as a strength, not a weakness. I heard today a great quote from a young woman, Alicia is her name, in a symposium that we had as part of Diversity Week. And what she said is, some see diversity as a threat to excellence. In fact, diversity is a requirement for excellence. She said that, not me. But I think she's right. She's particularly right in the kind of world in which we live, in the kind of world in which our students live. And we need to make that, I think, a core value of who we are at URI. We need to live that, model that, and make that a part of our daily identity. That commitment to diversity, to equity, and overarchingly to community. And that means we need to model it. We need to behave in ways that not just pay lip service to it, but bring our students, let's put it that way, bring our students into contact with it on a regular basis. And that should determine how we do everything. I think one of the things that will characterize, I hope, my leadership as the president of the University of Rhode Island is it's going to be a community team-based leadership model. The senior leadership of this university are going to work collectively, collaboratively, and not in ways in which we're isolated in silos, each with a different piece of the university to worry about. We're going to lead the university in a way where not everything is dependent upon the presence and the actions and the words of the president, because we will never be as responsive, as adaptable, as flexible as we need to be if everything that happens has to be funneled through any single individual. We can only succeed as an institution, I think, and therefore we can only succeed in our educational mission, I think, if we model our leadership differently and let the students know that this is what we value, and let our community know that this is what we value, and this is how we're going to go about the daily business of working together. And that's a goal for me in particular, as we think about how to guide the university. But I think it should be a goal for all of us in every way, is to think about how we can come together to build the kind of community that really has the attributes I've described. And we've taken a number of steps, and you know about them. We're committed now to bringing in a new associate vice president for community, equity, and diversity, who will be a direct report to me, and who will really have as a mandate. The complete portfolio is not defined yet. This is still a work in progress, but we want to move ahead as rapidly as possible. But we'll have a mandate to work with us to define the roles and scopes and responsibilities for that position. And we'll have a mandate to help us think every day about how we as a university can work together to foster community with equity, and a community that values diversity and sees it as a source of strength. So those are the priorities that I've been sharing, that I've come to think about are important for the University of Rhode Island and its immediate future. Priorities always will need to be re-examined. They'll always need to be rethought. And we want to be an institution that does that. And I think we've created some structures that exemplify that. I think with the creation of the new Strategic Budget and Planning Council, we have both a budgetary and planning mechanism that I think exemplifies the commitment to community, and at the same time the commitment to transparency, openness, and inclusiveness, and also the commitment to continual evaluation and analysis of what our priorities are, whether we're making progress, what new things we need to do, what old things should we stop doing, and how can we succeed in the climate in which we function or need to function. So that's just what I wanted to share with you. It took longer than I thought it would. Too much history at the beginning. Thank you for your indulgence, and I'm happy to respond to questions or comments or anything else that you would like to share. Thank you very much. I don't know if there's more food left or not. Please. Identify yourself. That would be helpful for the group.
I'm Joseph Santiago. I work with the GLBT Center here and Student Affairs.
It's okay, Joe.
I like a lot of what you said, and I think whenever we teach who we are, because when students leave, even myself, I've thought back to teachers, and as much of the subjects I've taken, I remember what they've shared of who they are. And I'm curious, you talked a lot about the divides, the challenges, and the gaps that students have and their families. How is the school positioning themselves to overcome that so they could actually become innovative and stretch out, so once the school has invested in them, that they will hopefully come back and invest in the school and become an international global citizen?
Very, very, very thoughtful question, Joe, as I would expect from you. I think you, with your last point there, I think you hit on an important, I think, element in all of this, and that is that if we succeed with our students, the students will help us be more successful because they will know that they have been prepared to achieve what they want to achieve in life, and many of them will achieve those things. And I think that's a critical element, ultimately, in building the university over time. In order to do that, the point is, I take your point, Joe, how do we plan, how do we budget, how do we assemble the resources for students to give them what they're seeking for us in these times? That's a very, very difficult question. And in part, I think what it means is we really do need to look at what are our opportunities to, one, bring additional revenues into the institution. And very frequently, that can come by virtue of expanded partnerships outside of the institution. I know that there are many in higher education and outside higher education who critique or criticize the growing, I think, number and magnitude of partnerships between higher education, particularly public higher education, and the private sector. I think on the whole, that criticism, not the critique, because I think that critique is always valuable in helping us reflect on what we're doing and why we're doing it and how we can do it better. But the criticism that this is somehow inappropriate, I think, is misplaced. Because one, the private sector is us. And in a certain sense, Congress has made it clear that we exist in part to help them to succeed. Because frankly, if they succeed, our students succeed, the society succeeds, and we have the possibility of building, as envisioned by Congress, a prosperous economy. And so we need those partnerships. We need each other to make that happen. And we're seeing opportunities for investment. And we've got several conversations underway that have that possibility for the University of Rhode Island. One of the things that we're looking to do with our undergraduates in particular, things that I think are a win-win for them and the private sector, or public nonprofits or communities, is get our students off the campus and out into those other contexts. Whether they're doing work, very good work, for a small business who would otherwise be unable to afford that expertise, they're learning while they're doing it. If we're working with a major corporation on their R&D issues, again, we're helping them succeed. Our students are learning wonderful things while they're engaged in that. And I think we need to look and foster those kinds of opportunities. It's part of what I envision when I said, let's rethink undergraduate education. One way I want to challenge us to rethink undergraduate education, and many of our faculty are doing this in many of our departments. This is nothing new. It's just a matter of thinking about how we organize it better, perhaps, how we grow it, how we make it more systematic, how we build it into the expectations of our students in better ways than we're doing right now. But we're already doing these things, getting our students out off the campus and into a variety of places where they are involved and have opportunities to learn in those environments that are very difficult for us to replicate back on the campus. And that provides a lot of assistance to a nonprofit organization, to have somebody that can come in and help them, learn a new accounting system, which may be beyond the expertise of anybody in that small organization that's doing critical work to help people in Rhode Island. Our students can get them up and running on that. It's not even difficult for them. But that small nonprofit may find it very difficult to pay for that service. Those are just some of the things that I envision for the way that we can, one, enhance education on the one hand, and two, become even more effective partners with our communities and the private sector than we have been in the past. And there are many others, I think, that we could do. Yeah. Hi, Merv. Yeah, go ahead. And introduce yourself.
I've been on this campus for 42 years in one capacity or another. Right now, I'm on the board of the foundation. And I think the first three things you said were givens. There's no question about that. But of course, coming up with the team concept, that I was so thrilled that you said that for number 4, because it's so important. And to repeat an old cliche, there's no I in team, and we won't win unless we work as a team.
Thank you.
I'm Professor Dooley in the English department, and I would like to include in a commitment to community, which I think is critically important across the board. And I would want to ask or remind us that we want to be sure to include in that community the adjunct part-time faculty who teach at URI. And that's my hope.
Thank you, Dorothy. And let me just, Dorothy, if you will, I'll comment on that. I think you're absolutely right about that. one of the challenges that we face, we being public higher education faces, and the data on this, again, are clear and depressing. And that has been the decline on many of our campuses of the numbers of tenure track and full-time faculty, and the growth on our university and college campuses of the number of contingent and part-time faculty. And I think that's problematic for a number of reasons. It's particularly problematic for a research university because it's only the full-time faculty, and in many cases only faculty who are on a research track or a tenure track that have the capacity to do what we've been talking about, namely engage in research and scholarship, and to engage undergraduates in that research and scholarship, and to teach graduate students the tools of the trade so that they can use that or become scholars themselves. So that, I think, for research universities is especially problematic. I think the other thing, which is in some ways a national scandal, and that is that the conditions under which many faculty now, young people who've come out, who've often spent 8 years more in college education and graduate studies, sometimes 9 or 10 years, to earn the advanced degree because they're passionate about teaching, joining the academy, and they're basically find a job market where there are so few positions available to them that the vast majority of them have no realistic hope of ever working in the way that they envisioned and trained to do. That's a problem for America. It's a problem for higher education. And one of the things I think that exists for us at URI is to get together and think creatively about how we can perhaps go against the grain. I mean, a goal for me, I've talked about it with Don DeHaze, our provost, it's a goal for him that he articulated long before I got here. And I think it's the right goal for the institution, is to work collaboratively together to come up with steps that we can afford, because we're not going to print money. I wish we could sometimes, but we can't. That we can afford to reverse the trend, to have more people here who are full-time, to have more of our faculty who are tenure track, to have more of our faculty engaged in scholarship, to create more opportunities for young faculty. By young faculty, you know, frequently I mean young people who came out 10 years ago and have been trapped in this cycle of moving from one part-time or full-time adjunct position to another, sometimes stringing together 4 or 5 appointments, which is possible to do in Rhode Island, at 4 or 5 different institutions in order to make ends meet. We need to, and some of those have been doing that for 10 years or longer. So I think that is a challenge we need to take on. I think it's very important that we take it on as an institution. I don't think we alone are going to solve that. But I think we can make progress, and we can show people how solutions can be crafted. And I think if we come together and can put some new ideas on the table about how we might do this, we can make progress that perhaps can demonstrate to other places and other institutions how they can do it.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Jody.
I'm Jody Lisberger, Director of the Women's Studies Program. First, thank you for coming to Out of Diversity to speak. That was a real thrill to see you in there today, so thank you. I had to come in a little late because I had to sponsor another event, but so you might have
Busy week for
spoken
you.
about this, yeah, already. I love the ideas of getting students involved in this, that, and the other way, but right now, at this point in the semester, I'm trying to get students to do the reading. And I don't think that's particular to my discipline. And so my question, and I'm teaching a large lecture at the 100 level, and I'm really tired of hearing this is too hard, it's a gen ed course, it's not supposed to be hard. And I'm wondering, I think it's marvelous to lobby the faculty, but what's being done in the student climate for academic excellence to put the responsibility for doing their assignments on the students? Because I think that if students aren't, and this is not just first-year students, this is a lot of students and a lot of people who have problems with students actually doing the reading, that we have to make our classes a little bit more punitive sometimes because we have to give a quiz, or we which takes away from this valuable, serious conversation we would like to have. So I'm just wondering in your plan how much of it can also go to the students to create a sense of academic responsibility there?
That's a very good question, and I think in a certain sense we are trapped partly in a national context for this. I think there's no doubt that many of our students, even if they're successful in high school, still arrive at a place like the University of Rhode Island not completely prepared for what they will find there, and not completely prepared to do the work or to work hard enough to succeed at the work. Because they've come through a public school system or outside the public school system where that's not really been an expectation. And I think that's part of the national problem. Part of the national context that we have to face right now are also, I think, a badly mistaken sort of consumerism model for what higher education is about. You know, we're not selling an education. It's not a commodity to be purchased. But a lot of people like to think about it and talk about it that way, including a lot of well-intended people from businesses and elsewhere who sort of think, why don't you think about it that way? Why don't you use these kinds of business models that we know are so successful in our realm for higher education? And I think the response to that is that parts of what you do in business may well be applicable, but other parts of the fundamental tenets of the business model, if you will, are not applicable to higher education, because in the end we're not selling a degree. That's not what you're purchasing when you come to the University of Rhode Island. What you're buying, what your money goes for when you come to the University of Rhode Island is the opportunity for you, the student, to work collaboratively with the faculty to create your own education. It's a creative piece of work. It's not something that exists on a shelf for you to buy. It's not something that sits in a boatyard for you to purchase. It's not something that sits on a car lot for you to purchase. It's not a commodity. It's something you have to make. And I think we've done a poor job, and many critics of higher education have done a poor job of understanding that what we're doing is we're not selling widgets, and that an education cannot exist without the full engagement of the student in creating their own education. And I do think we have a national communications problem about this. So I agree with you, Jody. It's a problem, it's a national problem, and what can we do locally to begin to counteract it? And I think part of the answer, I don't have the full answer, because it's a very complicated problem, and I think the full answer has to come from, again, the community. But part of the answer is community. We need to create a community where the students who come in learn from the students who are already here what the expectations are. Because those students have been here, they've experienced it, they've learned why it's valuable, they feel that they're prepared, they feel that they're competitive. Our alumni can help shape that message. And many of our alumni are quite willing to come back to campus, many on a fairly regular basis, to help get that message across to students. Hey, you darn well better read this stuff, because your ability to assimilate and analyze and write critically about what you've read, you're not going to succeed in the world after you leave the University of Rhode Island if you can't do that. And the way to learn how to do that is to do it while you're here. They will help us with that. I think one of the things that I would like us to think about in terms of how we think about teaching in undergraduate education is really thinking about faculty appointments, taking advantage of our alumni to create a whole series of temporary appointments. You're a professor in residence for a month. You're a professor in residence for 2 weeks. You're a professor in residence for 6 weeks or 6 months. And you come in because you can bring expertise, perspective, and that kind, I think, of advice to our students in disciplines that they're engaged in. Whether you're an artist, whether you're a writer, whether you're a corporate executive, whether you're an accountant, whether you're a practicing scientist, I think there are opportunities to do that, and that would help us get the message across. Help us build that kind of community. Those are just some thoughts I have right now. I agree with you about the magnitude of the problem, and I think it's one that we need to be very seriously attentive to.
I'm President Dave Ladally from Communications and Marketing. I want to get back to the funding a little bit. It seems to me that higher education in general, particularly public higher education, is kind of laying down a little bit. And I'm not specifically talking about the university, but this notion that the states and the federal government don't have an obligation to fund and back higher education. I think it's a tragedy that's happening both at URI and all across the country with higher education. I think back to my dad, who started here in 1936 and graduated in 48 because of the war years, and he absolutely lit up when we built the Ryan Center, because for the first time that he could remember, he built something that was really big, exciting, and showed the university to be on the move. But he also had this worry that the state of Rhode Island in particular, but even the nation now, is kind of a horse and buggy place. It's a place that doesn't think big. It's a place that does stuff on the cheap. And I worry about that greatly in this current climate. And I don't know if there are any crusaders, because I'd like to be one of them, but I don't have enough power and enough voice, that says public officials need to stop bleeding us, because we can't educate those sons and daughters of what we used to call the industrial classes, because those sons and daughters of the working classes can't afford to come here. They will select a place like CCRI or Rhode Island College because it's far less expensive. I would argue that the education isn't quite the same. But we're forcing people to make those decisions. And I, for one, think that public higher education leaders ought to be putting the heat on public officials and saying, enough is enough. When the prisons get more than the universities, then we certainly have our priorities in disarray, at a minimum.
Yeah, I agree with your perspective, Dave. And I think you're right. I don't think we need to lay down at all about this. I think we need to critically articulate and passionately articulate and frequently articulate the need for reinvestment in public higher education. It should be bothersome to government leaders. It should be bothersome to the people of the United States more broadly that you can go to a single university in China in a single area, say material science, and see more investment at that one university in that one area than the entire Northeast is going to make in terms of new investments in public higher education. And that's repeated at dozens of institutions across China. When one sees what is arguably still a developing country with 350 million people who aren't even a blip on the global economy, investing literally hundreds of millions of dollars, far more on a GDP basis in terms of new investment in public higher education, I'm talking about India now, than the United States is, that should be alarming. And again, they're looking at areas that they think are critical for global leadership in the 21st century. I think we should be very alarmed by that. And I think we should articulate the pressing need for better investment in America's public research universities in particular, and in higher education more broadly, by our state and federal governments. Now, but here's the reality. Depressing to me. Just read the poll. I think it was a poll of 5 states. 5 states that have some of the largest public institutions and the largest economies in the United States. And they asked people, what would you be willing to pay higher taxes for? That was the question. They would be willing to pay higher taxes to see improvements in K-12, majority. They would willing to be paying, in these states, pay higher taxes to see improvements in human services. But only 40% of the people polled in those states were willing to say that they would pay higher taxes for public higher education. That's a context in which we work. Now, we need to put together strategies collectively, nationally, to change those polls if those are indeed an example of the thinking outside of the 5 states or so that were actually participated in that poll. But it is sobering that that reflects the opinion of a majority of Americans at the moment. And the question is how do we respond to that? And I think certainly thoughtful communications and so forth will have to be at the heart of it. But we also need to sort of ask the question, why is there a lack of confidence in public higher education? And I think for better or worse, that's a question we have to confront head on. We have to acknowledge the fact that for whether it's justified or not, an increasing number of Americans do lack confidence in public higher education. They're not convinced by our arguments that we're efficient. And they're not convinced that the rise in tuition is money that's well spent, that isn't available there to simply be rebudgeted towards their priority. They're suspicious of how we're allocating our money. I mean, you all know the stories. You can read almost any blog about higher education, and some people, frankly, many such people, will weigh in and say, you know, the real problem here is faculty who don't teach, but get paid high salaries to go off and piddle around. A significant fraction of the American population believes that. Another population says, well, the problem here is the race to build ever more elaborate student facilities and provide this service and that service and funding and aid for every special interest group that can possibly walk onto the campus. People for, you know, ethical treatment of animals. People to hunt and eat animals. You know, both get support from the university. Why are you doing that, they ask us. Shouldn't that money be spent on hiring more teachers to teach classes? So our communications issue is actually much bigger than simply making the case that we deserve more money. It's, in some respects, in restoring the confidence of a lot of Americans in what we're doing. And I think that's why you're seeing these demands for accountability. That's why you're seeing legislators demand to see and to base funding on improving graduation rates and retention rates, because they believe that's something objective that can be measured and that we can't cook the data. You know, a lot of other things that we assert that are important to us, qualitative measures, the quality of what we're doing, competitiveness in scholarship and creative work, they're suspicious of, because they don't rely, they have to rely on us for the information. There's not an objective data set that they can go to and say, that this does really represent your performance, and we can measure it, and we can be confident that it's real, and we can see if you're doing better or not. But they think they can do that on things like 4-year graduation rates or 6-year graduation rates or retention rates or a whole of some of the other initiatives. And that's why we're seeing, I believe, those kinds of accountability measures become increasingly popular. We need to think about what that means and how we articulate our case in higher education for what we're doing and why we're doing it. Because ultimately, a focus on that kind of data, I don't disagree that they're important, but it completely leaves out Jody's point that this is a cooperative enterprise. People aren't coming in and are dissatisfied with the product that they're purchasing. They're coming in and they're frequently failing to do their part. And it's wrong to hold the institution accountable for that. They have an inadequate, frequently the critics have an inadequate appreciation for everything that makes for a quality education. Because quality can't be so readily measured. But we know what it is. Part of our job is to find ways to communicate that so that our public believes us when we do. And that's part of our challenge that all of us have. So it's a very complicated question out there, but certainly on a local context here in Rhode Island, I have been making the case. I will continue to make the case. I think you saw the Board of Governors make a very public statement when they approved the budget that had no tuition increases into it, but had $15 million in additional state funding, I believe, I think just for URI, in order to balance the budget and say this is what the state needs to invest in us so that we can keep tuition fixed at the current level, not drive up the cost of education to Rhode Islanders, and to make up for the decline in state funding that has occurred over the last 5 years, in which Rhode Island leads the nation. And the point I want to make to Rhode Islanders is that if you don't invest in public higher education, Rhode Island's not going to get out of this hole that it's sitting in right now. Because the basic problem that Rhode Island has in a global macroeconomic sense is that it's lost a lot of jobs that are not going to come back. New jobs can be created in Rhode Island, but a lot of the existing members of our workforce are not adequately educated to do those jobs. And unless public higher education is equipped and funded to do that education, as well as educate the new people coming in, the new kids graduating, Rhode Island is going to be stuck with a chronically underperforming economy, high unemployment, and shortages in revenue, difficult business climate, because we have a fundamental labor pool problem. And the response to fixing that really rests with URI and CCRI and RIC. And we can't fix it if we're not provided the funding necessary for us to do that. So if Rhode Islanders, and I believe they are interested in seeing this economy improve, and I think we can succeed at that, frankly. I think we can succeed at that. They need to accept the fact that if you're down in the bottom of the hole and you have lumber and a hammer and nails, that it does you no good whatsoever to build a comfortable box to sit on. But if you want to get out of that, then you got to use those same tools, namely the resources of the state, to build a ladder and climb out of the hole. And that ladder is public higher education. And unless you build that ladder, you're not getting out. And that's a message we need to get out there, I think, pretty forcefully. You know, that's been one of the things that I'm trying to educate people in Rhode Island about in a sort of a more tangible way. And one of the ways I've been trying to do that is say, look, you're currently, I say to the state legislature, I've said it in a variety of groups across the state, currently the state provides us enough money, basically, to educate 4,500 Rhode Islanders. 4,500. You look at the cost of education, and you look at, okay, per student, and then you look at how much money we get, and you ask how many students does that educate, given their cost of education. The answer is 4,500. The problem is I think we have something between 7,500 and 7,700 Rhode Islanders. So that means we're educating, in essence, about 3,000 of them for nothing from Rhode Island. So when I say that, one of the things I say you're buying, look, what the state is doing is it's paying for the education of its citizens at its institution, and right now it's paying for us to educate this many students, but in fact we're educating many more. And that gap is very problematic for us going forward into the future. So that's one way that I try to get it across. I mean, in essence, I want them to understand that their investment in the University of Rhode Island is really an investment in their own kids. And I want them to understand that everybody has a stake in the success of every Rhode Islander, because every Rhode Islander who graduates from the college or a university and goes out and is successful, that's going to help everyone in the state. The data are clear. Again, fewer demands on social services from people who are employed full-time at those kinds of jobs for which a college education is a requirement. Those people always pay taxes, almost always. There are a few scufflaws out there, I suppose, but they generally do, and they generally pay a lot because they move up the employment compensation ladder pretty quickly a lot of times. And so really, the more of those students who we educate and graduate and prepare for the 21st century workforce, the better off we are. The other point I make to them is what you're paying, in a certain sense, the University of Rhode Island to do is not just to create an educated workforce. You're paying for the University of Rhode Island to create new jobs entirely by creating opportunity, by creating employers. That is, its research and commercialization and technology transfer gets things out into the private sector on which new businesses can be built to employ people. And if we're not fulfilling our research mission and our outreach mission to disseminate that research, that doesn't become possible. And so those are some of the arguments that I've been sharing with people. And I My sense is that there's a growing realization across the state. When I talk to people at Providence Chamber of Commerce, for instance, when I talk to people in a whole variety of settings, when I talk to my fellow members on the EDC board, there seems to me, at least, a growing awareness of the truth of the assertion that everybody has a stake in the success of the University of Rhode Island, and the success of the University of Rhode Island will make Rhode Island successful. But that's, our work isn't done on that at all. And with regard to extension, I think one of the key things we need to explore is really bringing some of our folks out there who need it, particularly in business sectors and industry sectors, together with the state and saying, look, we need to provide more services. Is there a way that we can collectively partner? Both groups can put some money on the table to match what the feds are bringing in order for us to provide more. We're having conversations are amongst the sort of university presidents in New England about how we might be able to coordinate expertise. I mean, the way it was phrased in our conversation is, do we need a blueberry expert in New Hampshire and a blueberry expert in Massachusetts and a blueberry expert in Vermont? I don't see a lot of blueberries in Rhode Island, so I wasn't a party to that particular conversation. But the point was, well, maybe we don't. Maybe instead of 3, we can go to 2 or 1 and share the facilities and the resources necessary for that individual to work productively across a region as opposed to in a single state. So I think that's another opportunity for us as well, because we do need to find ways to generate and leverage resources in a way that we can get out there more than we have been, because I think that kind of work that we do is another way in which we can help advance the Rhode Island economy.
Just a quick question. In response to the faculty, I sympathize with you because when you said that the students aren't prepared, they aren't reading. A few years ago, we had a competitive grant request for writing across the curriculum because the faculty was so frustrated because the students were so ill prepared in writing. So we did, have a grant. But I wonder if that ties in with when you mentioned about working with the elementary and secondary schools, if we can build a stronger program of students going into the high schools. I think they do that. But to get these kids to realize before they come here that you really do have to be prepared.
That's a very good point, and it's part of the problematic context in which we work as the University of Rhode Island. In other words, over the last 20 years, we've had an entirely new mission added to our portfolio that Congress never really intended for us to do. And that is we're asked now not to just make up for inadequacies and deficiencies in the preparation of students who come out of K-12. Increasingly, we have to do that. But we're also asked to go in and to become directly involved with K-12 and help fix it. And that has never been previously a part of the mission of the land-grant university, really, because it was not necessary in most locales, in most states, for the land-grant university to take on that mission. But it's very much an expectation now. And our School of Education does great work in this. We've won millions of dollars from federal agencies, the National Science Foundation and others, to improve the teaching of junior high and secondary school science, to try to reach out to every school district and literally every science teacher in Rhode Island to improve their skill sets in teaching so that we can address these points and bring students in who are better prepared. I've been urging in my conversations with K-12 that Rhode Island adopt a standard for graduation from high school that is a standard of college preparedness. Even if you choose not to go to college, you are prepared to go to college. And that's the graduation criterion that we use. And we build our K-12 curriculum around so that when you graduate from high school, you are prepared to succeed in college. Because that's one of our problems with international competitiveness, is that in many countries that are our competitors, in an economic sense at least, there's little doubt that at least some of the data indicate that their students are graduating from high school better prepared in critical fields relevant to the economy and the development of economies in the 21st century than American kids are. Those are the so-called STEM disciplines, science, technology, mathematics, and so forth. That's an issue for us nationally that we need to be attentive to, I think. But we're not really funded by the state or anybody else to do that, except by virtue of the grants and contracts that we can bring in. And we're very, I think, competitive in that, and we've done a lot of good work in that area, but a lot more needs to be done. And part of it, yes, is teacher education. I think URI has a great record in admitting high-quality students into its education programs and producing very, very capable young people to go out and teach. I think we have a very strong record there. We probably need to think about how to increase the numbers who are able to teach secondary school and junior high school science and mathematics, because I think there's a national shortage and a Rhode Island shortage in those disciplines. We need to find ways to increase that. But we're doing a pretty good job. The question is what more can we do to help pull up public education? And part of it, I think, is we really do need to work with them about how you prepare students for success in college, what skills they need to have at the time of graduation in high school, even if they go directly into the workforce. What they still need those skills, I think.
Hi, I'm David Nelson. I'm a professor in cell and molecular biology. I'm the director of our graduate program and the director of the genomics and sequencing center. I really enjoy the history of the land-grant system. I subscribe to that greatly, and I really like hearing that you want to grow the research into what we do. It means a lot, but it raises a question. In view of some of the questions that have been asked about increasing number of non-tenure track or tenured faculty, the decreasing funding we're getting both from the state and, if you look at it, the sort of static funding at the federal level in terms of NIH, NSF, and so forth, how are we going to be able to grow that research end of things?
Yeah, no, I think that's a very tough question. It's a very good question. It's one at the heart of right now of what the Association for Public and Land-Grant Universities is working on, is at the federal level. Is just your point that the federal government is right now has two things that it needs to be attentive to. One is just growing the research budgets of the cognizant agencies that they need to invest in order for the American economy and American universities to be competitive. And two, they need to, I think, repair the damage that has been done through just sort of inattention for a long time with regard to the amount of money that they supply to institutions for the indirect costs of supporting the federally funded research. And the APLU has now made that a major focus of its efforts in DC. And it'd be interesting to see, how the Obama administration and how the Congress grapples with it in the midst of every other claim on the federal budget that they've got. But I think there's broad appreciation in Congress and in the Obama administration for the necessity of finding some way to re-energize the American university-driven research enterprise. And the question is to what magnitude is that possible, and what other compromises do they need to make elsewhere in the budget in order to do that? But again, the language is the language of, if you don't make the critical investments, you'll never get out of the mess that you're in now. You can spend money on a lot of things, but there's relatively few things that if you spend money for actually have a chance of improving your situation. And I think there's no doubt that investment in research and in the research universities can do that. And I think there's broad appreciation for that. But it's going to be a hard fight in Congress. We've got a lot of supporters in there. Senator Reid certainly amongst them. Senator Whitehouse certainly amongst them. Representative Locke certainly amongst them. We've got a strong team there. Who've been very supportive of URI and believe very strongly in URI's function as a research university. One thing I will say, which was remarkable to me, is even in this tough climate for funding, URI's research portfolio has been growing at a pretty healthy rate for the last 3 years, which means our faculty are becoming more competitive in a hotly competitive environment. And I think what we need to do is find ways to sustain that competitiveness. And one of the things we're doing, we're having a critical look at it right now, is we need to sort of make sure that when we recover those indirect costs, that we're strategically reinvesting as much of them as possible into the research and scholarly enterprise. Not just into the part that generates money, but actually into the entire research and scholarly enterprise, because that's one of the things we need to do, is be strong, I think, in multiple areas of disciplines, and some of those don't have the same opportunity for external funding that obviously sciences and engineering and so forth do. And I think we need to reinvest in those areas as well as in our science and engineering. But we also have to think very critically about investments that we can make in those disciplines that have the possibility of bringing in even more revenues. So we need to think about that, and Peter and Don DeHaze and others are really thinking through how we can use our recovered F&A funds, or indirect costs, more strategically in that regard. There's also the possibility for greater public-private partnerships. I've been very encouraged by conversations with some pretty big players about the possibilities for them coming in and becoming direct partners with components of our research enterprise, with certain departments and certain groups of faculty to build something together with funds flowing into the institution in part to do that. So I think we will have opportunities. We'll have to make the most of them because it's going to be a hotly competitive environment out there. It's going to be difficult to predict where we're going federally with probably a new Congress that will look very different from the one we have now and may have a different attitude about a lot of these matters. But I think we've got a good team federally. We've got good help federally in finding opportunities for URI. And we've got, most importantly, a strongly competitive faculty in a number of critical disciplines who've already demonstrated that they can go out and compete with the best. What we just need to do is find ways to help them succeed at even higher rates and to bring in more of them to the institution. I think that's why we need to think very critically about putting together resources to make strategic hires in a number of areas, either to strengthen what we want to do in the undergraduate curriculum or to strengthen what we need to do in the research and creative work areas. We need to look through every potential faculty hire through one of those two lenses, I believe, and bring in people that we think have the right backgrounds, the right goals for themselves, the right experiences to really move our agenda forward, recognizing that as we're successful, we'll create even more opportunities to bring people in.
The last point is what really, I guess I was trying to get at is we have, like any other school, an aging faculty. And it's the assistant professors that come in, they're going to be here for the next 20 or 30 years. And I see that we've had a lot of people retire, very few new hires. Just as an example, I know we have no immunologists on this campus, and we have no virologists on this campus, yet these are incredibly hot fields. But there are no funds.
Yeah. No, that's been the reality that I think we've had to work through for the last few years is we've balanced the budgets. In essence, what we've done is compensated for cost increases by leaving positions vacant. Because really, in a certain respect, even though we've raised tuition, all tuition has actually been enabled us to do is really compensate for the decline in state funding. It's not put any money on the table either to account for other cost increases borne by the institution or opportunities for us. And I think that's the cycle we've got to find a way to break out. All right, it's after 6. Have I worn you out? Thank you. Thank you, sir.